Hi, we're going to be reading from An Indigenous People's History of the United States. This is Chapter 1, Follow the Corn. History books often refer to the New World to talk about the lands now called North and South America. That term reflects a European perspective. That part of the world was not new to the people who had lived there for thousands of years when the Europeans arrived. It was home. Did you know societies have always had their own ways of marking calendar time? You're probably familiar with the abbreviations BC and AD. BC stands for before Christ. Anno Domini is Latin for year of our Lord and refers to the time since the birth of Jesus. Those terms have special meaning to societies in which Christianity is the dominant religion and are commonly used even in places where it is not. Two other abbreviations that acknowledge Christianity is not everyone's religion are also used in this chapter to respect that other religions, including those of the indigenous peoples discussed in this chapter, are just as important as Christianity. They are BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. This need not be confusing because the year 45 BCE is the same as 45 BC, and the year 1945 CE is the same as AD 1945. Human societies originated in sub-Saharan Africa. About 200,000 years ago, the people began migrating out from Africa and around the globe. Around 15,000 years ago, they began to occupy 7 areas. 3 of those 7 areas are on the land masses that are currently called the Americas. They're the Valley of Mexico in Central America, sometimes called Mesoamerica, the South Central Andes in South America, and Eastern North America. By around 8,500 BCE, societies in all 7 areas of settlement were domesticating and cultivating plants. In the Americas, the most important plant the indigenous peoples grew was maize, or corn. To do. Corn is an English word that has been used to describe grain crops, including wheat and oats. The scientific name for the corn that was cultivated in the Americas is Zea mays. Maize comes from the Spanish pronunciation of the Taino word for this crop, maíz. In the Ojibwe language, the word is mandamin. As more nations put their languages into apps and websites, you have opportunities to learn words in those languages. Take a look at websites that tribal nations have created. Some have links to pages about their language. See what other words for corn you can find. But note that the word maize, or maíz, comes from the Taino word, and the Taino are the original people of Haiti who were there when Columbus came and left all his men on Haiti. And so that's the indigenous group we get the word maize from. It's not a Spanish word. The Spanish took it from the Taino people because, remember, the Spanish had never seen corn before. The corn was only in the Americas. Europe, Africa, they didn't have corn at all before the 1400s. So the word is from the Taino people. The word barbecue is also from the Taino people. So a lot of our words actually come from them. All right, let's keep reading. Corn, a sacred food. Prior to 1492, corn did not exist outside the Americas. Scientists have evidence that indigenous peoples in central Mexico cultivated corn 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 BCE. 12 to 14 centuries later, 6,800 to 6,600 BCE, corn production had spread from the Central Valley south to the tip of South America, north to the subarctic, and to both coasts of the 2 continents. This proliferation of corn and other crops such as beans, squash, and potatoes required vast networks of cultural and commercial exchange among the peoples of North, Central, and South America. So people had to be trading for across thousands of miles to get the spread of goods and corn and other things that far. Thousands of years ago, indigenous scientists turned a wild grain into a food source that sustained their bodies and their spiritual lives. Unlike other grains, corn cannot grow wild. Without attentive care from indigenous peoples, it could not exist. The people of Central America cultivated corn in many colors. It was even grown in deserts and other areas that were very dry. Growing it there required complex irrigation systems. By the end of the 1500s CE, the total population of what we now call the Western Hemisphere was about 100 million people. Approximately 40 million were in North America and Mexico. Central Mexico alone supported about some 30 million people. For comparison, at that time, the population of all of Europe extending to the Ural Mountains in eastern Russia was about 70 million. Scientists attribute the significantly larger population in the Americas to a relatively disease-free society whose use of herbal medicine, surgery, dentistry, and hygienic and ritual bathing kept disease at bay. And that's true that indigenous Americans, Aztecs, Mayans, Incas, were way cleaner than Europeans. It's something that they comment on too when the Europeans come, and that helped them be healthier. Let's take a look at people and corn in the area that is now Mexico and Central America. Before we do that, let's consider this. In elementary school, did you learn that some indigenous peoples thought of corn, beans, and squash as the Three Sisters? Did you help plant a Three Sisters garden as a school project? Have you read a story about the Three Sisters? Do you know the source of that story? Do you know what native nation it belongs to? Those questions are important ones. It's true that native communities all across the North American continent grew those three crops, corn, beans, and squash, and told stories about them. They still do. But it's also true that native stories were appropriated, which means taken and used without permission, by white people, in ways that distort what they mean to the native nation that they belong to. It might surprise you to learn that many stories of how the Three Sisters came to be aren't native stories at all. They might look like native stories, but they were made up by people who are not native. Learning to ask questions about who tells a history or a story is an important goal of this book. What you read shapes how you think about the world, whether it is history or story, and it shapes how you look at and think about people in the world too. So again, learning to ask questions about who tells a story is really important. Let's keep reading. The origins of corn in Mexico and Central America. What we know today as Mexico and Central America are vast areas of land where many different nations of people lived and have lived for thousands of years. You can probably remember hearing about the Mayans and the Aztecs, but throughout the history of that region, peoples of many distinct nations were living side by side, sometimes trading with each other, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes absorbing or conquering one another. In addition to the Mayan and Aztec civilizations, the Olmec, Toltec, and Culua peoples thrived in Mesoamerica at different times. So did others, such as the Tepanec, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Some of these peoples conquered others. Many were then conquered by the Aztecs, who had migrated from northern Mexico. Conquered or conqueror, they all had one thing in common. They cultivated corn. The first great cultivators of corn were the Mayans. Their civilization was initially centered in what is now northern Guatemala and Tabasco, a state in present-day Mexico. In fact, the cultivation of corn was at the core of Mayan culture. Their religion centered around this vital food. The Mayans of the 10th century CE built city-states as far south as Belize and Honduras. Today, those who study Mayan culture are astonished by their art, architecture, sculpture, and painting, and their understandings of time and mathematics. By 36 BCE, they had developed the concept of zero and sophisticated calendar systems. They studied the movements of the moon and planets and predicted eclipses. Definition: a city-state is an independent state or nation consisting of a city and its surrounding territory. The Mayan people were governed by a system in which the priesthood and the nobility shared the power to make and enforce laws that affected all of Mayan society. War prisoners, criminals, debtors, and orphans could be forced into labor. Mayans who lived away from the cities worked for the nobles' fields and paid rent to use the land for their own needs. Their labor and their taxes helped to build roads, temples, nobles' houses, and other structures. And that is exactly like Europe, the feudal system in Europe. We do not know if they were content with this arrangement or if they felt exploited. Mayan dominance of the region lasted more than 500 years. Remember, the United States is only a couple hundred years old right Eventually, dissension and uprisings led to the collapse of the Mayan state. The end of their political power in the region did not mean the end of the Mayans themselves. Contemporary Mayan people live today throughout the lands of their ancestors. They speak Mayan languages, they have Mayan traditions. Mayans are still people today. They were conquered by the Spanish and obviously now live in countries run by different countries, but they are still here. At the same time that Mayan civilization was developing, the Olmecs, sometimes called Mexico's mother culture, flourished in the Valley of Mexico. The Toltec, Culua, and Tepanic cultures subsequently dominated and sometimes struggled for dominance in that region. Meanwhile, the Aztecs extended their influence in the valley and eventually consolidated their power. By 1426 CE, they and their allies had overthrown the Tepanics, and they soon moved to bring all the peoples of Mexico under their authority. The economic basis for the powerful Mexican state was hydraulic agriculture. I'm going to pause and look at the definition. Hydraulic agriculture means growing crops on a large scale using sophisticated methods of managing water, like draining swamplands to prepare lands for crops and building dams and irrigation systems to deliver the water that various crops need. And that is how, basically, they had huge farms for corn, and that's basically how they were able to become powerful. Corn was their most important crop, but beans, pumpkins, tomatoes, cocoa, and other food crops flourished and supported the dense population. They also grew tobacco and cotton. Weaving and metalwork were valued as works of art. Along with the crops, they were useful commodities in the marketplaces of each city and the trade networks initially established by the Toltecs. These networks reached into what we now know today as the southwest and west coast of the United States. Turquoise, macaw, and parrot feathers, seashells, obsidian, flint, and animal hides were among the many items traded among all the people who were part of this trade network. Remember, most of the western United States was Mexico, and it certainly was part of the Aztec trade network. The Aztecs flourished culturally, economically, militarily, and politically, but they faced growing rebellion by the peoples from whom they exacted tribute. Tribute is payment of some kind that a ruler demands of people who have been conquered. The Aztecs required tribute in the form of military service, physical labor, crops, and manufactured products. So when the Aztecs went around and conquered other people, they either made them join the Aztec military, they made them do work for the Aztecs, they took their crops, they took their products, whatever they demanded from them, basically in order for them to keep living. You can imagine that people didn't like the Aztecs because they would come in and conquer people and make them pay them. And so that is how the Spanish are able to overthrow the Aztecs. The Spanish conquistador Cortés recruited the rebels as allies, making it possible for the Spanish to crush Mexico and level its cities in a 3-year genocidal war. Again, Cortés gets all of these people who are angry at the Aztecs to join up against the Aztecs, and then he uses those people to overthrow the Aztecs, and then of course the Spaniards come in and kill a lot of people and take over. Though the Aztecs lost control of Mexico, like the Mayans, their descendants are part of today's societies in Mexico and the U.S. Aztec language is Nahuatl. Many places have Nahuatl names. Many words in Mexican Spanish are from Nahuatl. And of course there are many descendants, thousands of people who are descended from the Aztecs who still live in Mexico today. Let's turn now to corn in the area of the continent that we know today as the United States. Corn in the north. The area known today as the southwestern United States was once the northern periphery of the Aztec Empire. Most of it is a fragile land base where the elevation is high, rainfall is scarce, and drought is a part of life. That means it's a dry area. And yet, by 2100 BCE, the Hohokam peoples of that area had traded for and were cultivating corn, beans, squash, and cotton. Among their descendants are the Eskimo Odom. They built one of the most extensive networks of irrigation canals in the world at the time. The largest canals were 75 to 80 feet across and 20 feet deep. Many of them were lined with clay, which made them leak-proof. A single canal system could carry enough water to irrigate an estimated 10,000 acres. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and south from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, was one of the most fertile agricultural belts in the world. In the 12th century CE, the Mississippi Valley region was home to several large city-states that were built of earthen stepped pyramids, much like those in Mexico. The largest of those was Cahokia. Cahokia supported a population of tens of thousands, larger than that of London during the same period. The scale of their constructions and their agriculture infrastructure required sophisticated civic and social organization. One of the mounds at Cahokia is believed to be the largest earthwork in the Americas to have been built before European invasions. The people of these mound builder civilizations dispersed before the European invasion, but we know their descendants today as the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Natchez nations of the Southeast. These tribes retained some of the political complexity of the Cahokian culture. Their tribal governments had three branches: a civil administration, a military, and a branch that dealt with the sacred. Autonomous tribal towns made decisions about trade and relations with other towns, but in some political and social matters, the towns worked together as a confederacy to make decisions that affected all of their members. So you can see similarities between how the states in the United States come together to pass laws that affect everyone, and then the three branches of government is the same as what we have today as well. We have three branches. Let's look at the picture. This mound at Cahokia is about 98 feet tall and covers 14 acres, approximately the size of 14 football fields. It is currently named Monk's Mound after some Catholic monks who lived on or near it in the 1800s. Perhaps one day it will be renamed by native people whose ancestors actually lived at Cahokia. These southeastern peoples and their descendants today maintain important traditions related to corn, such as the green corn ceremonies. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes referred to as the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, developed in what is now the northeastern part of the United States. It was made up of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk nations, and was later joined by the Tuscaroras. This confederacy, a confederacy is just a group of people together. This confederacy incorporated 6 widely dispersed nations comprising thousands of agricultural villages and hunting grounds in what are currently known as New York, Pennsylvania, and Quebec, which is in Canada. By collective stewardship of the land and the clan village system of democracy, it avoided giving all the political control and decision-making to a single group. Corn, their staple crop, was stored in granaries and distributed equitably by clan mothers, the oldest woman from each extended family. In this confederacy, the clan mothers also played a key role in governance. They chose the men who would represent their clans in the governing councils, and they held the power to recall unsatisfactory representatives. They also had the right to speak in the council. So essentially, they were the ones who elected all of the leaders. Now, the leaders were men, but the women were the ones who chose them. So the men had to do what the women wanted, or else the women would remove them from power, which they could also do. Let's read this before we go on. Did you know? Oren Lyons, a member of the Onondaga Council of Chiefs, explains that the central ideas of the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. The first principle is peace. The second principle, equity, justice for the people. And the third, the power of the good minds, of the collective powers to be of one mind, unity. And the process of discussion, putting aside warfare as a method of reaching decisions, and now instead using intellect. That is what the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, that's what their whole society was based on, those ideals. Peace, equality, and unity. The Haudenosaunee people today retain a fully functioning confederacy similar to what they had before European arrival. The Haudenosaunee Constitution, called the Great Law of Peace, which is what we just read about, inspired some key parts of the U.S. Constitution. And that is absolutely true. Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin studied the Great Law of Peace. They studied the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and they took a lot of their ideas and used them to make the U.S. Constitution. even though we don't often, that our history books don't tell us about that, it really, our Constitution was hugely influenced by the Native American people, specifically by the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee, the same people, different names. The Haudenosaunee is the name they give themselves, and Iroquois was the name the French gave them. It's actually the name that another group gave them, and then the French called them that. No matter where they live, indigenous peoples' governance was based on valuing what was best for the community over the needs or preferences of individuals. Indigenous peoples sustain their populations not only by adapting to their specific natural environments, but also by changing their environments to meet their needs. This is regarded as stewardship, or being stewards of the land, which means taking care of something. A steward is someone who is responsible for the purposeful, careful management of resources so that the needs of a group can be met, both in the present and in the future. Someone who exploits the resources for gain only in the present, leaving them ruined for future use, would not be considered a steward. And you can make that connection to today and how we are not protecting our environment today. We're just trying to get the most out of it we can to get money and wealth, instead of thinking about what the earth needs for the future. That would be very against how Native Americans view the land and use natural resources. By the time the European invasions began, indigenous peoples had occupied and made changes to every part of the Americas. Let's take a quick look at two of the ways indigenous peoples managed their lands and resources prior to European invasion. We will specifically consider the use of fire for agriculture and game management, and the creation of roadways that span the continent. One main tool for shaping nature was fire. Indigenous communities regularly used fire in multiple ways that changed the pre-colonial North American landscape. For example, indigenous farmers in the Northeast always carried flints to start fires as needed. Such controlled fires helped to clear space in the forest for growing corn and other crops. Instead of the densely wooded wilderness the Europeans depicted in literature and art, the real American landscape included cornfields, berry patches, and groves of nut trees that contributed to the food supply. They used fire to clear space for other purposes too. Most indigenous peoples of the Americas, unlike the people of Europe, Africa, and Asia, did not domesticate animals for a ready supply of hides and meat. Instead, they created havens to attract elk, deer, bear, and other game for hunting. One strategy for doing this was to burn the undergrowth in the forests. In the following springtime, animals were drawn to the young plants that sprouted. Hunters killed what the community needed to replenish supplies of meat and hides. So they didn't keep pigs on a farm, for example, or cows or whatever. They just hunted them, and they would draw them close to them so they could hunt them instead of raising them up and then using them for meat or hide. The indigenous peoples who lived on the Great Plains also used fire to extend those vast grasslands to make more grazing lands for buffalo herds. With parts of the forest cleared by fire, the herds could roam the east. Native peoples also left indelible imprint on the land with systems of roads that tied their nations and communities together across the entire landmass of the Americas. These were not just hunting paths that followed game trails or routes that people could easily follow during seasonal migrations. They were well-traveled roads that tracked major rivers like the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri, Columbia, Colorado, and Rio Grande. Some followed seacoasts. One ran along the Pacific coast from an urban area in western Mexico all the way to northern Alaska. A branch of that road ran through the Sonoran Desert and up onto the Colorado Plateau. From the Pueblo communities of the Southwest, travelers took roads eastward onto the semi-arid plains along the tributaries of the Pecos River. Other roads led from the northern Rio Grande to the southern plains of what is now western Oklahoma by way of the Canadian and Cimarron rivers. The routes along those waterways led to others that followed rivers from the southeast and connected with roads that turned southwest toward the Valley of Mexico. From the Muskogee or Creek towns in present-day Georgia and Alabama, so where they live today, travelers could take a road north through the Cherokee lands and over the eastern mountains to where the Ohio and Scioto rivers met. From there, they could eventually reach the west coast on a route that followed the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and met the Columbia River Road. Going even farther, they could reach the large population center at the river's mouth and connect with the Pacific Coast Road. When Europeans arrived on this continent, they often seemed unaware that many conditions that were useful to them were the result of indigenous people's stewardship of the land. Some early settlers remarked that in many places they could easily have driven carriages between the trees. Others commented about large clearings in the forest, some with well-tended gardens and cornfields. They did not seem to recognize that for thousands of years native people had been making roads and clearing spaces to make trading, hunting, and agriculture easier. Willfully or not, they depicted the land as empty, devoid of civilized peoples, and theirs for the taking. North America in 1492 was not a virgin wilderness. It was a network of indigenous nations, a network of peoples of the corn. The link between the peoples of the North and South can be seen in the diffusion of corn from Mesoamerica along routes created by the people and used for millennia. Both Muskogees, Creeks, and Cherokees, for example, whose original homelands in North America are located in the southeast, trace their lineage to migration from or through Mexico. Cherokee historian Emmett Starr, who uses the spelling Muskogee, wrote, "The Cherokees most probably preceded by several hundred years the Muskogees in their exodus from Mexico, and swung in a wider circle, crossing the Mississippi River many miles north of the mouth of the Missouri River, as indicated by the mounds. The Muskogees were probably driven out of Mexico by the Aztecs, Toltecs, or some other of the northwestern tribal invasions of the 9th or preceding centuries. This is evidenced by the customs and devices that were long retained by the Creeks." Traditions related to corn are practiced throughout the indigenous agricultural areas of North America. Some elements are similar to those in the Valley of Mexico. Although these practices vary from one community to the next, at the core of each dance, of each song, of each prayer, that is a commemoration of the gift of corn. The peoples of the corn remain connected in spite of the heavy influences of colonialism. This picture says, "Seeds were stored in seed pots from one season to the next. The small opening kept the corn safe from rodents. The design on this modern seed pot by Pearl Talke of the Nambe Pueblo depicts a corn plant." This brief overview of pre-colonial North America counteracts the settler colonial myth of the wandering Neolithic hunter in vast unused and uncharted lands. Indigenous civilizations were based on advanced agriculture and well-developed systems of governance. It is essential to understand the complex interrelationships indigenous peoples had before European invasions. It is also essential to understand that those relationships have evolved in ways that continue to bring indigenous people from around the world to protect key resources from exploitation. In 2016 and 2017, indigenous people from 6 countries came together to resist construction of a pipeline that endangered water resources. They took a stand as stewards of the land, supporting each other's struggles in the 21st century. They stood together at Standing Rock. And here's a picture. Native people today are still involved in protecting their communities and their resources. This photograph shows members of many tribes who gathered at Standing Rock in North Dakota in an effort to stop a pipeline that threatened an essential water source. So, important to realize that Native Americans still exist today. They still live in our country today. They still live in our communities today in this country. And their traditions are still alive today, even if the governments under which they have to live now don't accept their traditions and their ways of life. They still practice them. So we're going to continue to learn about them as we move forward. But this section talks about the importance of corn to the native people of North and South America. Next, we'll read about the culture of conquest.